So, well, yeah, I don't know how many people are gonna be taking this test or, uh, but so I guess if anyone has any questions, does anyone have any specific questions, or you want me to just kind of, you guys, hopefully you saw that I posted the study guide. Um, you guys can hear me, right? Yes, maybe. All right, so right, so the tests, right, the tests, every grade from every grade since March 13th is only goes in. You can't hear me? Did you? Mitchell said he can't hear me. Um, I'm not sure what, did you make sure your stuff's turned on from your end? But so anyway, but yeah, the test, the grade will only go in if it raises your test average. So um yeah, so it's hopefully, you can try and see how you do. But so I don't know if you guys saw the study guide that I posted, but if you have that, I'll just run through some stuff that's on there and kind of go over a few of the concepts. So some of this stuff's pretty easy. I don't know, Mitchell, can you hear me now or not? I don't know if he left or tried to rejoin. But so the first part's pretty easy, the top of it. The main job of the executive branch member is to like carry out or enforce the laws. Um, so legislative makes the laws, and then the executive branch enforces those laws. Remember, a lot of law enforcement's actually done by the federal bureaucracy, like the people who work for the federal government, not necessarily the top leaders like the president. Um, the president. So in Article 2, they lay out the powers of the president. So we have. So you need to know those formal powers that I had in the PowerPoint. Um, but anyway, things like, the power to negotiate treaties or appoint judges and other officials, the power to command the armed forces, the power to convene Congress and veto legislation, all that. So just make sure you go through those and that you're familiar with. Remember, Congress has the power to declare war, but the president is the commander in chief. That means he commands the armed forces. State of the Union is one of his sort of powers or responsibilities, giving a State of the Union every year. Remember, he uses that oftentimes to like lay out his agenda for what he wants to accomplish, what he wants Congress to pass, like his agenda items. He also talks about, accomplishments that he sees himself that he's made and things like that. But it's kind of it's a way to promote, the state, that we have a strong union, but also to like lay out the his agenda for maybe the next year of his in office. Informal powers, the president, remember, are like just as important about, pretty much as the formal powers. So you have like executive agreements, which is important to understand. He can make an agreement with a foreign leader without Senate approval. And hold on, Mitchell's trying to get in again. Mitchell, let's see. So executive agreements, there's two differences between a treaty and an executive agreement. Treaties are, do require Senate approval, and executive agreements do not. So executive agreement is a lot easier to get, but the downside is that the next president doesn't have to abide by the previous president's executive agreement. So like if Obama made an executive agreement, Trump could just ignore it. But if it was a treaty, all presidents are supposed to like uphold previously signed treaties. Executive orders. Remember, the president can order, an executive agency to take a certain action, or he can, do things that are within his powers. He can do executive order, which has the force of law. He also has like informal powers, like access to many experts, access to the media. We call it the bully pulpit. I don't know, Mitchell, can you hear me now? Or are you there? Um, but the bully pulpit is it means like he has a great platform to like reach out to the American people. So, like Trump, it can be good or bad, because if they use it to promote their plans and their agenda, that can be helpful for them. But in some ways it can be dangerous if you say things that are, not true or irresponsible. But the president has like an excellent platform to reach out to people. Um, so I don't know what's going on with Mitchell. It says connecting. Now can you hear me, Mitchell? It says you connected to the audio.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, there we go.
I'll post the recording if you want to go over. I'll post it later. So,
All right.
Anyway, so you also have to know the roles of the president. So, so there's 7 roles that we went over, or that I went over. Like chief executive, head of state, chief economic planner, chief legislator, chief diplomat, party leader, and commander in chief. So remember, those are different from his powers, but it is similar because it's related to some of his powers. But like chief executive, he's the head of the executive branch. He can like hire and fire, appoint people. He's supposed to enforce the laws, but that's again largely done by his subordinates and people in the bureaucracy. Head of state members, more like ceremonial stuff. Can be like speeches, or hosting a foreign leader for like dinner. If he was like negotiating an agreement, that would be more like chief diplomat. But if it's more of just like a you know taking a foreign leader on a tour of Washington or something, that would be more like head of state. But anyway, throwing out the first pitch at a baseball game, all that stuff. So and like chief legislator, of course, he can like sign and veto legislation. And then commander in chief. So he is the head of the armed forces, but he can't declare war on another country. The requirements to be president, remember there's 3 legal requirements. You have to be at least 35. You have to be a natural born citizen, which doesn't mean you have to be born in the US, just means you have to be a citizen from the time of your birth. And then you have to be a resident of the United States for 14 years. His term of office is a little tricky because, it used to be you could be elected as many times as you wanted to, but the term is 4 years at a time. Originally, presidents could seek multiple 4-year terms, like more than 2. But now the 22nd Amendment was passed. Remember, after Franklin Roosevelt, he was elected 4 times. So they passed the 22nd Amendment after he died. And they said the president can only serve 2 terms, like 4 years each, right? So now there is an exception, 10 years, but that would only be if the vice president took over for the president and served out the last 2 years of his term. He could seek 2 additional terms, but that hasn't ever happened. So pretty much if you're elected, like Donald Trump, Barack Obama, whatever, they would be limited to total of 8 years maximum, right? 2 4-year terms. So you need to know the 22nd Amendment, but also the 25th Amendment, remember, was put in place to answer questions of like what happens if the president isn't dead, but he's disabled, and the vice president, one of the only powers the vice president has in the Constitution, is to help determine if the president is disabled or unable to perform his duties. So the president's not dead, but he's in a coma or something. The vice president could take power temporarily or possibly permanently. But the 25th Amendment also says, like, if the vice president leaves office, the president gets to fill that vacancy with a new vice president, things like that. So it answers a lot of what if questions. Let's see. So the vice president doesn't have a lot of specific powers. He can help determine presidential disability, And his other big thing is he can preside over the Senate as president of the Senate. Remember, that's not that big of a power. There's several questions about the Electoral College, so make sure you review, if you need to go back and review that from the PowerPoint. But basically, the electoral system was set up to elect the president because they didn't trust the people to make that direct choice. And so instead of it's like a middle group that gets to do it. So we vote for the electors who get to then vote for president. Remember, each state, the electors are not determined by population, but by how many members you have in Congress, right? Representatives and senators. So like Georgia has 16 electoral votes because we have 14 House members and 2 senators. Most states do what's called a winner take all. So popular vote matters, but only within each state. If you win the popular vote in Georgia, you get all 16 electoral votes. So even if you win by, a slight margin of popular vote, you get all the electoral votes. But there are 2 states that don't do that. That's Nebraska and Maine. Remember, they do it by district. So each congressional district counts as 1 electoral vote. So if you win a district of that state, you get that 1 electoral vote. And the other candidate, you could end up splitting the votes. And then the winner of the overall state total, the state popular vote, gets the 2 extra votes that count for the 2 senators. So like in 2008, Barack Obama got 1 vote from Nebraska and John McCain got 4. Yeah, so the winner of the election is whoever wins the electoral vote, not the popular vote, right? So you win the popular vote of a state, that wins you those electoral votes, but the overall national popular vote doesn't really matter because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote nationally, but lost the election because of the electoral vote. Remember, you have to get 270 electoral votes to win. So sometimes this happened twice where no one got a majority. And so then if nobody gets a majority of the electoral votes, then the House would choose the president with each state getting 1 vote as a House delegation. So that happened in 1800 and in 1824. All right, as far as, you also have to know the president, some of his top advisors. You have the cabinet. The cabinet is just a sort of a name that we came up with for some of his top advisors that head up the different executive departments. So like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, all those people, plus the Attorney General, the Vice President, and pretty much anyone else he wants to put on the cabinet. So it's an advisory body, but you also have like the cabinet officials head up their departments. Okay, so Secretary of State is the head of the Department of State. Secretary of Treasury is the head of the Department of Treasury. The president gets to appoint these people, but they have to be approved by the Senate. Remember, there's also a term you need to know, the inner cabinet. So it's sort of just a term that, political scientists came up with in textbooks and stuff. But the inner cabinet is sort of like the cabinet officials who are typically more important and more influential. And those are those top 4, the first 4, the Secretary of State. And you have to know what these people do too and what these departments do. So remember, the State Department's in charge of U.S. foreign policy and like embassies and stuff. So they're trying to keep peace with other countries. So you have the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, which is in charge of the military branches. You have the Secretary of Treasury. So the Treasury Department does like tax collection and debt management and stuff like that. And then you have the Department of Justice, which is headed by the Attorney General. So those 4 officials are considered the inner cabinet. Normally you would have to know who those people are, but we're not going to do that on this test. This test is only going to have 40 questions. I just narrowed it down because we haven't gone over as much stuff. But yeah, so you don't need to know their names, but you need to know what they do, or what those departments do. Also, Homeland Security, even though it's not technically inner cabinet, the Homeland Security Department is also something you should know. So they help protect us, and they're really important right now with this virus and stuff, because they're the FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. So they've been trying to send out like medical equipment to the states, and so you have FEMA, you have Border Patrol, you have airport security. All that stuff is part of the Homeland Security Department. They originally was supposed to stop us from being attacked from like terrorist attacks, but now they do other stuff as well. Then you have the other, that's one big part of the federal government, the cabinet departments. Then you have the other big part you need to know is the executive office of the president, the EOP. And that consists of several important agencies. The purpose of the EOP is more to like directly advise the president on issues and policy. So you have like, for instance, National Security Council, the White House office, the Council of Economic Advisors, the Office of Management and Budget. So you should kind of know what those different agencies do and be able to identify those and like their what roles they play. So that stuff's also on that handout I gave you with the matching of departments. Yeah, so you have, I guess I should also post the answers to that because make sure you guys have the right answers. But anyway, so you especially like the White House office, remember those are like his personal staff members who work in the White House. So it's headed by someone called the chief of staff. And usually the chief of staff is like a really important advisor to the president, and they manage like everything that goes on in the White House. So the chief of staff usually is a top advisor to the president. They'd also be part of the cabinet and part of the National Security Council and everything. You also have people like, usually the press secretary plays a fairly important role because they're the ones who communicate for the president to the media and to the White House press corps. Now that hasn't happened under Trump very much because his last press secretary, she never held a single press conference over the course of like a year. But in normal circumstances, every other president that I've ever seen has like the press secretary would give daily updates to the media on what's going on. Anyway, so you also have the White House counsel as part of the White House office. That's like his legal advisor and things like that. So all the way, the first lady has a staff, the vice president has a staff. All those people are part of the White House office. Okay, so that's all the EOP. And then you have independent agencies. You have the federal bureaucracy. All of that's part of the federal bureaucracy. So remember, bureaucrats are sort of people who just perform the day-to-day functions of the government. We're people who work for the federal government. Most of them are career officials, not appointees. And so you could be someone who works, like the CDC, someone who's a scientist for the Center for Disease Control, or it could be, someone who works in the Social Security Department and answers people's questions and about their Social Security benefits or like distributes benefits. Someone who works in the Parks Department, the Department of the Interior, a park ranger, or someone who does, analyzes satellite data for the Defense Department. All those people would be bureaucrats, postal workers, all that stuff. But independent agencies are less controlled by the president. He has some control, but he gets to appoint the members. But remember, I think I explained that they're kind of staggered, like their terms are staggered and they have longer terms. So the president's not supposed to have as much control if it's like the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Federal Election Commission or National Labor Relations Board, because their job is to like administer the laws in a fair and unbiased way. And so if the president had a lot of control over those agencies, that could lead to like him tampering with these things, which we don't want. Like we don't want him showing favoritism to certain groups who might get punished and another group doesn't. So like if you break, or anyway, so he can appoint these people, but like we want them to be more independent. So he can only fire them for cause, like if they're corrupt or do something really bad. Whereas he can fire his cabinet officials or like his personal staff members whenever he wants. So just know that like independent agencies, the president has some control because he can appoint people to these, but he doesn't have ongoing supervision. The checks and balances, so remember, the main thing is like the president can veto bills from Congress. He can appoint judges. He can also pardon criminals, which is sort of a check on the judicial branch. As far as checks on him, the judicial branch can strike down presidential actions through judicial review and like say he did something unconstitutional. But the Congress has a lot of checks over the president. They can override vetoes. They have to approve his appointees, right? So like cabinet departments, judges, stuff like that. But they can also impeach the president, right? So impeach and remove. We've never had a president removed, but we've had 3 presidents impeached. Recently Trump was impeached. Remember, that means accused. accused of wrongdoing. So the House impeached him, then the Senate would hold the trial, right? Like they did. The Senate listens to the evidence presented by the House. The Chief Justice presides over a presidential impeachment trial, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And so Trump was impeached, but not removed. Bill Clinton was impeached, but not removed. Andrew Johnson was impeached and not removed. Remember, Nixon was not impeached because he resigned as he was being investigated. And then presidential succession, just know sort of the order. It goes after the president, the vice president would take over. We've never had to go beyond that. But if that did happen, if the president and vice president both died or something, you'd have the Speaker of the House, then the president pro tempore of the Senate, which is like the most senior senator from the majority party. Then it would be the cabinet secretaries, and there's 15 of those, right? So 15 cabinet departments. The starting with Secretary of State, because that's the oldest department, then Secretary of Treasury, I think, and then Secretary of Defense and so forth. So that's the presidential succession. You know, executive privilege. So that's just when the president sort of says certain things are protected, certain things should remain secret and private when he talks to his officials in the White House or gets advice. He doesn't have to reveal that. He can try to say it's covered by executive privilege. So like when Congress was trying to get information during the impeachment inquiry, Trump claimed a lot of executive privilege. And like he said, some of his officials couldn't testify against him because of executive privilege and stuff. In U.S. versus Nixon, the Supreme Court case, Nixon tried to hide the White House tapes and tried to claim executive privilege. You need to know that in that case, the court ruled executive privilege is a thing. It does exist, but it has limits. So in Nixon's case, he did have to turn over the tapes. Even though he claimed executive privilege, the Supreme Court rejected his claim and said he had to turn them over. And that's what really busted him in the Watergate scandal. So executive privilege exists, but it has limits. It has to be some specific reason why the president wants to keep things secret, like national security or really private information that doesn't have a public interest. And then the last thing I have on here is war powers resolution. So remember, Congress tried to rein in the president because presidents often use their powers, commander in chief, and they'll take military action or order a military strike. But Congress can, or what they said in the War Powers Act or War Powers Resolution, is that the president, if he does take military action, he can do it, but he has to tell them what he's doing within 48 hours. And then he only has 60 days to engage our forces in some type of conflict. If he doesn't get congressional approval, like declaration of war or authorization of some sort, he has to then withdraw those troops within this, after 60 days. So it gives him a little bit of leeway, but he can't like fully engage in like a prolonged conflict without congressional approval. All right, so that's just a quick overview of the study guide. I know I was going pretty fast, but do you guys have any questions or anything else you want to go over? So the test is open note, you can use all your handouts and notes. Okay. All right. So I'll post this, so if you guys have friends or classmates that you think want to review and didn't get a chance to make it, I'll try to post this on Edmodo. But yeah, so the test will be available tomorrow, and I will. I don't know. Yeah, if on Edmodo, also just if you guys have questions, you can ask me on Edmodo, or I'll try to see if anybody has questions about the outline and stuff. But otherwise, you can take the test tomorrow, and good luck. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.